The humid air of a New Jersey summer night in 1982 pressed down like a wet blanket, trapping the cloying scent of charcoal smoke and the fading perfume of wilting petunias around the Miller family's backyard. Cicadas, hidden in the unseen canopy of maple and oak, thrummed a relentless, nerve-fraying chorus that seemed to vibrate in the very teeth of anyone who listened too closely. Eleanor Miller, her floral print dress clinging uncomfortably to her back, the fabric already damp with perspiration, fussed with a stack of flimsy paper plates on the patio table. Her movements were a little too quick, a little too precise, each plate aligned with a rigid exactitude that betrayed a jittery energy beneath her composed surface. She smoothed the edges of a paper napkin with a thumb, then moved a plastic fork half an inch to the left, then back again, her gaze darting towards the street beyond the fence, then quickly away. Frank, her husband, stood sentinel by the humming charcoal grill, flipping burgers with a forced, almost theatrical cheerfulness. Each turn of the spatula was accompanied by a little grunt of satisfaction, a sound that felt more performed than felt. A sheen of sweat glistened on his forehead, catching the uneven glow from the string of bare bulbs strung haphazardly above the patio, casting long, dancing shadows. He laughed a little too loud at nothing in particular, a short, sharp bark that cut through the cicadas for a moment, then dissolved. His eyes, though fixed on the sizzling patties, darted towards the driveway every few seconds, a tic he couldn't seem to suppress. He wiped his brow with the back of his hand, leaving a greasy streak. David, their son, arrived first, his late model Monte Carlo rumbling up the asphalt drive, the engine a low, throaty growl that cut through the evening stillness. The car, a pale blue, pulled to a stop with a gentle hiss of brakes. He emerged in a slightly too tight polo shirt, the collar stiff, carrying a six-pack of Coors held loosely in one hand. His usual confident stride, the one that carried him through construction sites and client meetings, was a touch less assured tonight, a subtle hesitation in the way his feet met the pavement. He offered a tight smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Hey, Mom, Dad," he called out, the cheerfulness in his voice sounding a little thin, stretched. "David, you made it," Eleanor said, her voice a little too bright, a little too high. She turned from the table, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Frank, meanwhile, nodded, a quick, almost imperceptible dip of his chin, still keeping one eye on the grill. "Grab a beer, son. Got him on ice." Sarah followed moments later, her older model Honda Civic pulling in behind David's car, its engine a softer, more polite purr. Her sundress, a splash of cool blue against the oppressive green of the lawn, seemed to offer a momentary visual relief from the heat. A wicker bag swung gently from her arm, bumping against her hip with each step. She looked tired, a faint smudge under her left eye, but her smile, though weary, held more warmth than David's. "Hi everyone," she said, her voice soft, carrying easily over the cicadas. She walked straight to Eleanor, offering a quick, light hug. Polite greetings were exchanged, punctuated by the clinking of bottles as David reached into the cooler Frank had pointed out, and the persistent sizzle of meat on the grill. The sounds felt like punctuation marks in a conversation where the real sentences were all unspoken. David tried to engage his father about the latest woes of his contracting business, something about a delayed shipment of lumber for a deck job. "Yeah, this supplier, I swear, they're living in another century. Can't get a straight answer out of anyone," David grumbled, popping open a beer with a satisfying hiss. Frank's responses were clipped, his gaze distant, his eyes still flicking towards the empty street. That's a shame, son. You'll figure it out." He didn't offer advice, didn't even truly listen. He just flipped another burger, the motion automatic. Sarah, more attuned to the unspoken currents that flowed beneath the surface of family gatherings, noticed the way her mother's hands trembled slightly as she arranged plastic cutlery, lining up forks and knives with an almost frantic precision. Eleanor's eyes, too, flickered towards the street with an almost desperate anticipation, a silent question hanging in the humid air. Sarah caught her mother's eye for a fleeting second, a silent acknowledgement of the tension, before Eleanor quickly looked away, busying herself with a stray leaf on the patio table. Sarah felt a familiar knot tighten in her stomach. The struggling air conditioner inside the house offered a faint, mechanical hum, a counterpoint to the natural symphony of the summer night. It was a sound of human effort against the overwhelming heat. From the kitchen, through the open sliding glass door, the tinny strains of a classic rock song, "Don't Stop Believin'," wafted out, momentarily swallowed by the relentless chorus of the cicadas, then emerging again, a hopeful, slightly muffled anthem. Just as Frank was urging David to grab another beer from the cooler, his voice a little too loud again, a beat-up Ford Granada, a model that had seen better days years ago, sputtered into the driveway. Its approach was a cacophony of groans and rattles, growing louder, more insistent, until its exhaust coughed a thick plume of blue smoke that hung momentarily in the still air. The engine died with a final, shuddering gasp, leaving an abrupt, echoing silence. Frank froze, spatula still in hand, a burger poised midair, a perfect, sizzling circle of char and meat. Eleanor dropped the stack of napkins she was holding, her sudden, jerky movement sending them scattering across the patio, like white birds startled into flight. The air seemed to thicken, suddenly heavy with unspoken dread. Out of the driver's side, a man unfolded himself, his movements slow and deliberate, as if each joint was stiff with disuse. He was thinner than Frank remembered, his frame a little stooped, his hair grayer, a patchy salt and pepper. But the same unsettling glint, a peculiar mix of weariness and something sharp, remained in his eyes, even in the dimming light. His clothes, a faded denim shirt and work pants, looked worn, out of place amidst the suburban barbecue tableau of plastic plates and bright floral dresses. He carried a cheap bottle of bourbon by its neck, the label peeling slightly, his thumb hooked around the rim. Art Jenkins. David and Sarah exchanged confused glances, their initial pleasantries, their attempts at normalcy, forgotten. David's brow furrowed, a silent question passing between him and his sister. Who was this man, this stranger who had just arrived in a cloud of blue smoke and silence, and why had his sudden appearance sucked all the oxygen out of the humid New Jersey night? Art offered a greeting that was far too loud for the quiet evening, a forced smile stretching across his face, not quite reaching his eyes. "Frankie, Ellie, long time no see, eh?" His voice boomed, carrying across the manicured lawn and into the hushed twilight. Frank's own voice was tight, almost a growl, as he asked, "Art? What in God's name are you doing here?" Eleanor, her face already pale from the day's heat, moved forward, a desperate, almost instinctive attempt to usher Art inside, away from the neighbor's prying eyes, away from her children's innocent ears. She reached out a tentative hand, a silent plea in her gaze. But Art merely waved her off, dismissing her concern with a casual flick of his wrist. He surveyed the patio, then, with an air of unshakable permanence, settled into a vacant chair, the plastic groaning faintly under his weight. He took a long, unapologetic swig from the bottle he carried, his eyes sweeping over the Miller family one by one, a knowing, unsettling smile playing on his lips. He started talking then, his voice a low rumble, about the old days, vague references to shared history that only Frank and Eleanor understood. Each word, each half-finished anecdote, seemed to cast a heavier pall over the gathering, suffocating the last vestiges of the afternoon's easy warmth. David and Sarah, caught in the sudden, inexplicable shift of atmosphere, tried to be polite, their young voices uncertain. "Would you like a burger, Mr. Art?" David offered, holding out a plate with a charred patty. Sarah, ever the more observant, offered him a beer from the cooler, her brow furrowed slightly. Art merely chuckled, a dry, humorless sound, declining the food and the drink he hadn't already brought himself. "Nah, I'm good," he said, his gaze settling on Frank. "Just here for a little reminiscing. Remember that summer, Frank? The one that changed everything?" Frank nearly dropped his beer can, his knuckles turning white as he gripped it, the metal creaking under the sudden pressure. The cicadas, which had been a steady background hum, seemed to intensify their buzzing, filling the sudden, thick silence, making it feel heavy, oppressive. Eleanor's eyes, wide and darting, met Frank's for a fleeting second, a silent, desperate conversation passing between them that the children couldn't begin to decipher. As the evening wore on, the bourbon in Art's bottle steadily diminished, and his comments grew less veiled, more pointed, like small, sharp stones thrown into still water. He spoke of the way things were handled, about paying the price, his gaze fixed on Frank with an unnerving intensity. Eleanor, her face a mask of frantic composure, moved around the patio like a hummingbird, a flurry of motion. She offered more food that no one wanted, cleared plates that hadn't been touched, her movements a desperate, almost frantic attempt to create a whirlwind of normalcy that might somehow blow away the encroaching dread. Sarah watched her mother's hands, noticing the persistent, barely perceptible tremor that belied her forced cheerfulness. It was a tremor Sarah had seen before, in moments of quiet stress, but never quite so pronounced. David, usually oblivious to anything beyond his own immediate concerns, the next baseball game, the latest album, felt a prickle of unease that he couldn't quite place. He tried to ask Art how he knew his parents, a simple question that felt weighty in the charged air. Art just smiled cryptically, the bourbon slurring his words just enough to make them feel both casual and sinister. "Oh, we go way back," he drawled, "before you two were even a twinkle in their eye." The phrase hung in the humid air, heavy and loaded, a dark cloud settling over the patio. Frank's jovial facade, already cracking under Art's relentless prodding, now completely shattered. His face, usually ruddy and open, hardened into something unfamiliar. With a sudden, jerky movement, he grabbed Art by the arm, his grip surely bruising, and pulled him aside near the overgrown rose bushes at the edge of the yard. The thorns seemed to catch the last light, glinting malevolently. Frank's voice was a low, furious growl, barely audible, meant only for Art. He thought he was out of earshot, but Sarah, feigning a trip to refill her empty glass with soda, positioned herself near the open kitchen window, the screen door offering a thin veil of privacy. She caught snippets of their hushed, angry conversation, fragments that drifted on the humid air like dark whispers. Words like mistake, buried, never forget. The oppressive heat of the summer night and the bourbon Art had consumed amplified the raw emotions, making them thick and tangible, almost suffocating. A cold dread, sharp and sudden, settled in Sarah's stomach. She remembered fragmented childhood memories, hushed arguments behind closed doors that would suddenly cease when she or David entered a room, her parents' sudden, unnatural silences when certain topics arose, often about the past or old friends. She recalled a recurring nightmare her father used to have, waking in a cold sweat, his breath ragged, though he'd always dismiss it as just a bad dream. Quote, she slipped inside, ostensibly to help Eleanor clear the growing stack of untouched plates, but her real aim was to find something, anything, that might explain this suffocating tension, this sudden, terrifying shift in her parents' world. She made her way to the basement, a cool, damp space that smelled of concrete and forgotten things, where her father kept old boxes filled with relics of their lives before David and Sarah. Tucked away in a dusty photo album, beneath faded snapshots of family vacations to the shore and grinning childhood pictures of Frank and Eleanor, she found it. A newspaper clipping, yellowed and brittle with age, folded carefully into a creased envelope. The headline, stark and grim, announced a missing person case from a neighboring town, dated 15 years prior. The name of the missing young man, Michael Jenkins, Art's younger brother. The brief story mentioned a car accident near the local quarry, a search that yielded nothing, and no body ever found. The date on the paper was 1967, not 82, but the name, Jenkins, clicked into place with a sickening thud, reverberating through her entire body. David, meanwhile, stood on the patio, trying to make sense of the unfolding drama. He saw his father's face, a mask of rage and fear he had never witnessed before, a raw, animalistic expression that made his stomach clench. He saw Art, looking almost triumphant in his drunken haze, but also deeply, profoundly sad, as if the victory he sought was a hollow one. A sudden, profound disconnect washed over him. His parents, who had always been the unshakable pillars of his world, suddenly felt like strangers, their lives stretching back into a past he knew nothing about, a past filled with secrets. He approached Eleanor, who was now standing by the grill, staring blankly at the cooling coals. His voice was tight with confusion, edged with a fear he hadn't known until this moment. "Mom, what's going on? Who is that man?" Eleanor's eyes welled up, her hand flying to her mouth as if to stifle a cry. She shook her head, muttering, "It's nothing, darling, just old history." Her denial, weak and trembling, only deepened his suspicion, fueling a growing anger that was as much directed at his parents for their secrecy as it was at the man who had brought it to light. Sarah returned to the patio then, the newspaper clipping clutched in her hand. Her face was pale, almost translucent in the dim light cast by the patio lanterns. She looked from Art, who was now staring blankly into his almost empty bottle, to Frank, whose back was stiff with defiance, his shoulders rigid, then to Eleanor, who had retreated to the far corner of the patio, her shoulders hunched, her face buried in her hands. Sarah held up the brittle piece of paper, her hand shaking so violently the edges of the clipping blurred. "Michael Jenkins?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the relentless chirping of the cicadas, which now seemed to scream in her ears. The world seemed to stop. Frank's eyes went wide with a primal fear, a raw terror she had never seen before, stripping away years of paternal authority and leaving only a vulnerable, desperate man. Eleanor let out a small, choked sob, her hands flying to cover her face, as if to hide from the devastating truth Sarah had unearthed. Art looked at Sarah, his expression a mixture of surprise and profound sorrow, the triumphant glint in his eye replaced by a weary resignation, as if a long-held burden had finally been lifted, but at a terrible cost. Art, now fully drunk and seeing the dam broken, began to speak, his voice raspy and slurred, but clear enough for every word to cut through the humid air and into the horrified silence. He didn't offer a detailed account, but enough to paint a horrifying picture, each sentence a brushstroke of their shared, terrible past. That summer, 1967. A joyride, a party by the quarry, a place notorious for teenage mischief, a magnet for reckless youth. Frank, younger, full of himself, always the leader, always pushing the limits. Michael, Art's younger brother, always looking up to Frank, eager to impress him, eager to be part of the group. A dare, a stupid accident near the water's edge. Michael fell, or was pushed, or was hit. The details were hazy, lost to time and liquor, but the outcome was stark. Frank panicked. Instead of calling for help, instead of facing the consequences, he panicked. He covered it up. Art had been there too, he admitted, but fled in a drunken, terrified haze, only to return later to find nothing but Frank's frantic, desperate pleas to keep quiet, to make it all disappear. They moved the car, staged a disappearance, a cruel charade. Frank, with his father's connections, his family's influence in the community, managed to bury the initial investigation, to make it all go away, to whitewash the truth. Eleanor, knowing or suspecting enough, had helped him maintain the lie, built their entire life on it, a gilded cage of deceit that had now shattered around them. Frank, cornered, his face a mask of desperation, tried to deny, to deflect, to shout Art down. He tried to paint Art as a bitter, jealous man, always looking for trouble, always looking for a handout, a parasite clinging to their success. "He's always been like this," Frank bellowed, his voice cracking with the effort, always trying to bring people down. But his voice cracked, betraying the lie, and his eyes, wide and frantic, betrayed him too, flicking between Art's accusing stare and his children's horrified faces, seeing the judgment, the disgust, the utter disbelief reflected there. He looked at David, then at Sarah, his carefully constructed life crumbling before them like a sandcastle hit by an unexpected tide. The air crackled with a silence far louder than any scream. When Frank finally lunged, it wasn't with the old, formidable strength, but a desperate, pathetic lunge at Art, more a collapse than an attack. It was a brief, clumsy struggle, limbs tangling without real force. A man utterly spent trying to grasp at something, anything, to stop the unraveling. Eleanor, her own face a mask of grief and shame, found a surge of strength she hadn't known she possessed. She pulled them apart, her hands firm on Frank's shoulders, her voice a low, choked whisper that cut through the humid night. Then, finally breaking, her eyes, red-rimmed and swollen, met her children's. The words came out in a raw, ragged torrent, years of suppressed guilt and unspoken fears finally bursting forth. She admitted that she knew. Not every detail, not the full horror, but she knew Frank was involved. She had helped him, out of a fear so deep it had become a part of her bones, out of a desperate, misguided love for the man she married, and out of a primal, animalistic need to protect their future, to protect them. Her confession was a landscape of quiet sacrifices, of a truth that had always been a ghost in their home, a chill that no amount of summer heat, no amount of carefully arranged normalcy, could ever truly dispel. She spoke of the constant vigilance, the way she'd learned to read the shadows in Frank's eyes, the quiet compromises she'd made with her own conscience, each one a tiny erosion of her soul. David was furious. The man he had looked up to, the pillar of the community, the father who had taught him how to throw a baseball and change a tire, a murderer. A cover-up artist? The betrayal was a physical ache in his chest, a burning wound. He lashed out, his voice cracking with the force of his anger, his face contorted in a mask of rage that warped his familiar features. All these years? You lied to us? To everyone? How could you, Dad? How could you? His gaze flickered between his parents, disgust warring with a profound, sickening disbelief. He couldn't reconcile the man before him with the image he had carried his whole life. Sarah, quieter, was numb with shock. The fragmented pieces of her childhood, the unspoken fears she'd felt whenever her father's mood shifted, the coldness she had always sensed beneath the polished surface of their perfect suburban life, suddenly made terrible, brutal sense. It was as if a hidden mechanism had clicked into place, revealing the dark gears that had always been turning beneath their feet. She looked at her father, seeing a stranger, a monster hidden beneath a respectable veneer. The man who had tucked her in at night, who had fixed her bike chain, was now utterly alien, a chilling revelation that left her breathless. The night air, once humid and stifling, now felt cold, a chill seeping into their bones despite the lingering heat of the day. The cicadas continued their relentless, deafening song, a harsh, buzzing backdrop to the shattered silence that had fallen over the Miller patio. Art, having delivered his terrible burden, looked utterly spent, his anger replaced by a profound weariness that seemed to age him decades in a single breath. He pushed himself up from the plastic chair, his movements stiff and slow like an old man. Without another word, he turned and left, disappearing into the humid darkness beyond the porch light, the cheap bourbon bottle left on the table like a discarded, incriminating weapon. Its faint, acrid scent mingled with the charcoal smoke. Frank was slumped in his chair, utterly defeated, his face buried in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent, ragged sobs that tore at Eleanor's already broken heart. Eleanor herself was weeping openly, her body racked with tremors, her breath catching in her throat. David paced the length of the patio, a caged animal, his anger still a raw, burning wound. He couldn't look at Frank, couldn't even stand to be in the same space as the man who had been his father. He felt a profound sense of loss, not just of his father's carefully constructed image, but of his own past, now irrevocably tainted by this horrifying revelation. Every memory felt poisoned, every shared laugh a lie. Sarah sat motionless, the yellowed newspaper clipping still clutched in her hand, the brittle paper almost crumbling under the pressure of her fingers. She felt a deep, chilling sorrow for Michael Jenkins, for the life he never got to live, for the quiet desperation that had driven Art for so many years, and for the parents she thought she knew, now revealed as strangers capable of such a monstrous deception. Her own identity, once so secure, felt adrift, unmoored, as if the ground beneath her had vanished. David stopped pacing abruptly. He declared he needed to leave, to get away from them, from the suffocating truth, from the house that now felt like a cage. He grabbed his keys from the small table by the sliding door, the jingle of metal a stark, metallic punctuation mark in the heavy, suffocating silence. His departure was a definitive crack in the family facade, a fissure that would never heal, a promise of permanent separation. Eleanor tried to stop him, her voice weak and broken, a desperate plea, "David, please." But he didn't even pause, his jaw set, his eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the patio. Frank didn't even look up from his hands, lost in his own abyss. Sarah, after a long, agonizing silence that stretched to an unbearable length, finally stirred. She looked at her mother, then at her father, her gaze steady, devoid of David's immediate, explosive rage, but filled with a colder, more resolute understanding. She spoke, her voice clear and firm, cutting through the thick, oppressive air. "This can't stay buried anymore." She wasn't sure what she would do, or how she would do it, the path ahead utterly obscured, but she knew with an absolute, terrifying certainty that the quiet complicity, the years of unspoken lies, ended tonight. She carefully folded the newspaper clipping, the brittle paper rustling softly, and tucked it into her purse. It was a physical manifestation of the burden she now carried, a tangible piece of the truth she would not let disappear again. Eleanor, her face streaked with tears, tried to reach for Frank, her hand hovering uncertainly over his bowed head, a gesture of instinctual comfort. But he flinched away, recoiling from her touch as if burned, a shudder running through him. The distance between them, built over years of lies and fear, was now vast and unbridgeable, a chasm that had swallowed their marriage whole, leaving only echoes of what once was. The barbecue grill still glowed faintly in the dark, a forgotten symbol of the evening's intended purpose, its smoke now just another layer in the humid, heavy air, carrying the scent of ruined plans. The house, once a sanctuary of suburban normalcy, now felt like a tomb for secrets, its walls whispering echoes of betrayal and long-held pain. The humid air hung heavy, but now it was not just the weather, it was the crushing weight of a truth finally spoken, and the terrifying unknown of what came next. The Miller family, as they had known it, was over. The dawn would bring not clarity, but the blinding, painful light of a new, horrifying reality. The future, once secure and predictable, was now a gaping void. Sarah watched the streetlights flicker, casting long, wavering shadows on the quiet street, a solitary figure in the humid night, the full, immense weight of the decision she'd implicitly made settling upon her shoulders. She knew there would be no going back, no pretending, no more quiet complicity. The summer of '82 would forever be etched into their lives as the summer the truth finally broke free, leaving only wreckage in its wake, and the chilling promise of a new, uncertain dawn. How was the story today? I want to show you a memorable scene, if there's a moment that overlaps with my memory, the story of that time, the scenery in my memory that I used to go to often. I feel for someone I can't meet anymore, the small things that come to mind right now, please leave it as a detail. If you're curious about a story that's released at the same time every day, subscriptions and notification settings are very helpful in creating videos.